Hello and welcome back everybody to the JournalismAI Festival. My name is Mattia. You know me by now if you've been following these sessions still since Monday. I am the project manager of JournalismAI, and I'm really excited to welcome you here for this session number 8, I think, of this festival. Not that the numbers mean anything to you, it's just important for us in the background. So really excited to have you here. We're back at the JournalismAI Festival. It's day 3. We have been hosting this festival still since Monday online. And the festival is a celebration of the most exciting developments at the intersection of journalism and artificial intelligence, as this slide says. We are the Journalism AI team at Polis, the journalism think tank of the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Journalism AI is funded by the Google News Initiative. We have been doing over 3 years research, organizing training programs and creating training opportunities for newsrooms as well. And especially we have been managing collaborations between newsrooms. And we're here today to hear from some of the participants of one of our core collaborative initiatives about the work they have done together, experimenting with AI. To enjoy the festival, remember that you're following us on YouTube if you're seeing this video, and you can ask your questions on the YouTube live chat, where my colleague Lakshmi already dropped a comment a few minutes ago. Everyone is warmly encouraged to join the community on Telegram as well at t.me/journalismai. We have more than 500 people from really every corner of the globe learning together about AI and how it can be used in journalism. Please use the JournalismAI hashtag on social media if you share what you're learning through the festival. And you can always go back to check the program of the festival at journalismaifestival.com, where you will find all the information about the festival itself and all the sessions and the speakers. In case you don't receive it yet, sign up for our newsletter. We have launched a challenge this morning. We want to reach 4,000 subscribers before the end of the year. We are close, so please share the newsletter, sign up, which you will find on the festival website and everywhere else with your colleagues to help us get to that point. And our last encouragement to really enjoy the festival to the fullest: be open, be curious, be kind. We're all here learning together about a complex topic. There is no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to try to understand how AI can help us improve journalism. So open, curious, and kind are the qualities that we look into everyone else and in ourselves first to try really to learn together during this festival. Later today, we have a session at 4:15 p.m. GMT, so London time, about how to make the most of AI for your newsrooms with speakers from the US and Brazil. But now I'm here for the session larger than articles. How might we build the news experiences from smaller units of content? I have 4 fantastic speakers and 1 moderator coming up on screen very soon. My role is to introduce David Caswell of BBC News Labs, who will moderate the session today. David has been a good friend of Journalism AI since the very beginning of the project 3 years ago, and also has been supporting our teams during the collab challenges over the past 6 months. And without further ado, I'm going to let David explain us a bit more about the title of the session and what we're here to listen to today before introducing the speakers themselves. So David, excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mattia, and thank you to the entire Journalism AI team. This last 6 months with the 2021 collab has been fascinating. I've learned a ton, and it's been a real privilege to be involved. So the topic today is about a very specific, a very particular application of AI, specifically about using AI or AI techniques or AI tools to try to enable news experiences that are larger than the traditional experiences of news. So if you look at the familiar units of news, like articles or programs in radio and television, those are pre-digital artifacts. Those have been around for a very long time. We've seen in the session on Monday that Shirish Kulkarni moderated, we've seen that there are techniques with AI to work with news at a level that is smaller than the article or the program. And we'll see, I think on Friday, there's an interesting talk about ways to automate some of those kind of smaller units. But today we're going to look at something different, which is how might we assemble these smaller units of journalism or even articles and programs into larger, longer experiences of news. In other words, ways to navigate news stories and subject matter that extend over a broader period of time. As with all of our AI endeavors, problem solving for our audience is kind of at the heart of this. And there are certainly a lot of use cases for these larger user experiences around providing more understanding and more context for enabling habits that are maybe not the news junkie habits where you're consuming news all the time, but perhaps consuming news less frequently, and so on. I'll introduce the teams, and we'll get a. You're probably familiar with the format of these now. We'll get a bit of a demonstration from each team about what they've done in the Collab experience, and then we'll move into some questions and some discussion around those, and then have some time for audience questions at the end. So the first team is from Swedish Radio, and they're going to talk about their experience with components of audio programs. And I'd like to introduce Kajsa. Kajsa Norell is the head of the Playdesk at Swedish Radio, and Erik Sillén is the data scientist at Swedish Radio. And I'll hand it over to them to provide a demonstration of their project.
So thank you very much. We're a team from the Swedish Radio, as David said, and we decided to focus on podcasts. And the challenge was, how could we use modular journalism to better serve underserved audiences? So modular podcasts or segmented podcasts, that was a new thought, at least to us. But when we started to dig into it, it all made sense. So many people listen to our podcast every day, but we also have some trouble serving younger and especially more diverse audiences. So maybe you recognize this situation where you're trying to find a quote or part of a podcast that somebody recommended to you. It's not always easy. Let's be honest, the episode descriptions, they are not always perfect. And you can't actually search the actual audio. And even if you find the right podcast episode, you might have to scroll back and forth through hours of radio or audio, often with several different topics in it. And you need to find 5 specific minutes, and it can be really difficult. So this is a problem. So imagine now if a friend tells you about some hilarious moment of an hour-long podcast, and you could actually search within the podcast episode about mental health issues, racism, or climate change for that matter, and find exactly what you're looking for without all this noise of the 2-hour chunks. Our podcast would be more useful to the audience, at least that's what we think. To test this, we first tried to edit playlists manually out of podcast snippets. And unlike our colleagues in the Purple team who worked with articles and tried to modularize these playlists out of podcast snippets really worked really well. And we also realized that many of these podcasts and radio shows, they were segmented by music. They had music in between the snippets. So that made it really easy to segment it automatically too. But then to make the audio searchable, we needed to transcribe the audio. And after that, we used 2 different techniques for entity extraction. And we were also using another AI technique to find similarities to match different audio snippets with each other. And then we built a user interface to let editors search through these audio snippets. And in the first step, we think we are going to let the editors do it. It might not be ready for the audience directly. And Erik is with me today, and he actually built this user interface, so he's going to show what it looks like. Also, we built also 2 different ways of presenting it, like one playlist and the other one is timelines. And now, Erik, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Kajsa. So let's pretend I'm an editor and I'm creating a playlist about a story about the AstraZeneca vaccine. So I enter some relevant search terms and automatically tagged audio segments show up as results. I can get a quick overview of the content in an audio segment by reading an automatically generated transcript. And this looks good to me, so I'm satisfied with the content of this segment, so I add it to the playlist. And there are some other audio segments that I also like, so I add them to the playlist as well. Next, I click on the Show Similar Segments button. And this displays the most semantically similar segments, and it's a great way to dig deeper into a story. And as before, I can click on the transcript button to get a quick overview of the content of an audio segment without actually listening through the entire audio. And this looks good to me. So I add that audio segment and a few other audio segments to the playlist. And at this point, the playlist is getting ready to be exported to our audience. But we can also display this as a playlist, as a timeline of events. And the selected segments are shown here as points in time according to when they were aired. This way of showing it, this timeline, is a great way to repackage and present a story containing previously published segments in a rich and contextual fashion. And we are looking forward to serving this product to our audience. Now back to you, Kajsa.
Thank you, Erik. And it was not only me and Erik who were on the team, it was also Tobias and Emil. And I think that was one of the most rewarding things with this project for me personally, that I got the chance to work with people from the tech side. I'm a journalist myself. And I also was really inspired by the other teams, also the team from Deutsche Welle, Nils Saale and Cluster. This kind of constructive take on journalism really resonated with me. So we're really happy to take any questions you might have.
And maybe we'll just hold the questions until a little later on, and move through the other team, and then we can bring those in as we have the Q&A. That's really interesting. I mean, I'm just watching your presentation. I was taken by how I increasingly don't see a distinction between radio and podcasting in the digital world. Audio is audio, regardless of where it comes from. So now let's move on to a different interpretation for looking at these sort of larger collections of content, kind of bigger than the original units from which it came from sometimes. And we'll look at storylines. And the team in the collab this year that explored storylines is from the TX group in Switzerland. And so we've got Tim Noner, who's the chief data scientist at TX, and also Timo Grossenbacher, who's the team lead for the sourcing and automation team. And I wonder if you can just go ahead and give a quick overview of your project.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm going to start. As Kajsa has just said, the idea behind this challenge was to identify an ill-served audience and to make the news experience better for this ill-served audience. So when we start from that ill-served audience related to our topic of storyline detection, we could say that, or we came to the conclusion that basically most of our audience is ill-served when it comes to finding the beginning or the end or everything in between of a storyline. So an actual sequence, a chronologically ordered sequence of events revolving around a particular phenomenon. So one example we have here on the right side is that accidental shooting on the set of Alec Baldwin's Western movie. And so we published quite a lot of articles on that shooting, as others did as well. And So we have this related articles section at the end of our articles. So these are the 3 articles you see there. However, for the reader, it's extremely difficult to actually go to the very start of the storyline and find the first article that was published on a certain story. So the reader knows exactly what happened at the very beginning. At the same time, our own staff has a hard time remembering what they've actually written about that particular storyline. So they have a hard time surfacing the articles they've written just 2 or 3 weeks ago, especially if there are a lot of articles on a specific storyline, like in this case. So what if we could, first of all, suggest our staff the most relevant but also most engaged articles, so articles that were read a lot and engaged with a lot, belonging to that storyline for an article they are currently writing. So we have in mind a kind of a suggestion mechanism. So the journalist is writing the article, and at the same time, he or she is being suggested articles that were already written on the same sequence of events. So the journalist would be in the loop and would still have to decide, okay, I want to include this, or this belongs to this storyline, or this does not belong to that storyline. And then secondly, what we could also do is provide our readers with a good overview of the actual events. So in this case, we had like the first article, this accident happened, we don't know much yet. And then second article would be, it turns out the gun was loaded with actual ammo and not with, just mock-up ammo, etc., etc., etc. And then we could even build a visual overview of the story that we published. So we had a couple of approaches. We went through some prototype algorithms, and Tim, our chief data scientist, will now quickly tell us what his main approach to the problem was, and yeah, what we achieved with that approach.
Thanks, Timo. So yeah, let me just go quickly through the technical background, because fundamentally the technical storylines is very much related to text clustering, but that's like a fairly well-known problem. But in our context, we had some very specific challenges. So one of the challenges we have is like, we don't really know how many storylines we have. So in a corpus of several thousand articles, there could be hundreds of different storylines, and we don't know this upfront. And many of these storylines will just contain a few articles, and these are all things that like standard clustering approaches would have problems with. As Timo said, we ran quite some iterations of experiments, and most of the approaches, they produced some false positives, basically storylines that were detected, but which haven't been really storylines when given to a journalist to evaluate. So we want to be very confident that the storylines that we present are real storylines. So we also with a strong explainability. So yeah, in the end, we didn't want to be too academic, so it was important for us to have some kind of prototype running quickly, which we can like move into some kind of product to evaluate and not make too many turns on the technical background side. So finally, we settled on a graph-based approach, as you can see like in the middle. So each article in our corpus is a node in this graph, and we connect articles if they're kind of similar. And similarity in this case is expressed if we have like similar persons or organizations in these articles. The motivation behind this is that we realize that storylines often develop along persons and organizations. So it's like a theater drama. And this gets supported by our AI infrastructure, since we are already extracting persons and organizations from articles. So have this in our database, and we can bootstrap this information very easily using this method. So yeah, and finally, once we have built this graph, we look for very much connected subgraph, which corresponds to storylines in a huge percentage of cases. So in the middle, you can see a lot of articles about the Oscars from last year, and we have on the right some example storyline we extracted about the movie Nomadland of Chloe Zhao, which has been released last year. So that worked pretty well. Obviously, there's lots of things to improve here, like the whole temporal aspects are a little bit something that we want to investigate further. At the moment, we have quite strong restrictions on how the time frame storyline is allowed to stretch over. But we think that with some more iterations, we could fine tune our approach here to cover other cases. So yeah, that's basically the technical approach we're using at the moment.
Thanks a lot, Tim. So yeah, what are the results? What are the upcoming challenges? We find that the algorithm works pretty well if we restrict it to find stories that were published within the same 30-day window. So the example with Alex Baldwin's movie has actually turned up. The algorithm actually surfaced all the articles we've written on the subject except one. So we've also written an article about, how can, basically that's the article at the very bottom there, and the title is "How Can You Die by a Mock-up Gun?" or how can someone die through a mock-up gun? And I think we assume that the reason the algorithm hasn't detected it is because the names, the popular names of that storyline, for example, Alec Baldwin, weren't mentioned in that article, even though it was especially written as for providing context for that story. So it has one false negative, an article that wasn't detected, but it didn't turn up any false positives, meaning articles that are not actually part of the storyline. We think that the algorithm yet has a harder time detecting longer lasting storylines that stretch over several months or even years. And then it would be extremely helpful if it worked, because sometimes we have, there's certain events and then we report on them, and then there's a couple of months of a break where nothing happens. And then it's especially hard for our journalists to remember what they've written about a couple of months ago. So that would be nice. That's definitely the next challenge, to widen this restriction. And also sometimes, as Tim has already mentioned, we find a couple of storylines that are very closely related to each other. So maybe one storyline about the movie Nomadland, but another storyline about another movie. And then the question is, do they actually belong together, or could they be kept separately? So that's also something we need to invest more time in. But we think we made significant progress over the course of Journalism AI, and want to take this opportunity as well to thank the organization Journalism AI, Polis LSE, and also all the members of the other media companies that joined us in this great endeavor.
Great. I think we go to the larger conversation now with the Swedish radio team in the room also. There you are. Okay, so let's dig in and talk about this for a little while and go through some questions. One initial question I have is around the potential for these for serving audiences in new ways, and especially these audiences that news is not doing a very good job of serving these days. And I know these are both prototypes, but perhaps you could discuss just a little bit in your own ways how you would see this working, perhaps in a later more fully featured product, and what kind of user needs or audience service could this provide that isn't being provided in the news environment as it exists now? Maybe the Swedish radio team could start.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, but I think, for example, there is a big interest in issues regarding racism, for example, and I wouldn't say we don't really have full radio shows or programs dealing with that. So in many podcasts, you would get, one piece here, and then 2 weeks later, one snippet there. And for somebody specifically interested in this issue, they would really have to go through some serious stories about foreign policy, about, stuff that they might not be interested in at all. And we might in this way provide them with more specific pieces playlists or something that they might be interested in. So I think there's a big potential for this, actually.
So would you?
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. So what Kajsa said is true, and I would just like to provide a bit more context of how that would work. So it would be from us. We have a vast archive of old episodes. So for us, this is especially an important issue to solve. That our editors they don't really know exactly what's in the archives, and this will enable them to build playlists and larger programs coming from snippets from things we have published before. And this makes it possible to make these focused programs of specific topics that Kajsa was talking about. And also with this timeline concept, we can also provide context to current affairs. For example, the upcoming Swedish election. It is possible to give context to what has happened in different topics that people are talking about or politicians are talking about.
And also for stories about, for example, the murder of our former Prime Minister, Olof Palme. There's this story that keeps coming back, this new development still, There was a TV series this year, and it's nice for somebody who wasn't born at the time to get an overview of the events in the investigations, for example.
That sounds like an interesting one to bring the TX team in on, because those storylines, especially those that go over, I guess that one's going over decades, not just years. How do you see the kind of the new user features and use cases for serving users in kind of new and valuable ways coming out of this kind of view of news experiences?
Well, we think there are several ways. One would be that visual storyline for stories that are very, where the actual chronological sequence has a lot of importance. That's one thing, and it would be highly beneficial if we could automatically generate these visual overviews instead of manually picking them together. And secondly, another thing would be, with our storylines, we could also add some other metadata to the articles. For example, whether it's an interview or whether it's an explainer or even, an interactive visualization or something. And then we could, maybe automatically or semi-automatically suggest to the reader something like, there's this must-read interview with this person on that storyline, or if you want to understand how this works, read this explainer. So we think of it as a foundation stone for a lot of features that we can use for and make the experience better for our users.
Both of these are examples of what you might call augmented journalism, where the AI processes are delivering a set of options to journalists for them to configure and make the final decisions on. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about how that connected with the workflows and the expectations within your respective organizations, and what the what the openness was to using the augmented workflows like this to supplement the existing processes.
It's the question for me. I think I've been surprised by how open the organization has been to this kind of perspectives. So we have an appointment tomorrow where the big national newsroom wants to know everything about this. So I think there is a big openness in how to use our stories in new ways.
Also on our side, something we couldn't show yet, but we're currently working on some internal tool just to display different storylines, and we want to see basically what the response is from people. As Timo said, it's not 100% clear to us, like which use case might be successful, going straight to the customer or going to the journalist as a decision support tool. I think that's the interesting part here. We are providing some base technology, and we want to see what people make out of that, and if that's interesting, maybe just for reporting purposes. So we're not 100% sure yet here.
No.
But what maybe one point to add here, I mean, what we discovered also in other experiments we've made, we need to tightly integrate these tools into our editorial workflow. So they need to be part of our core systems, our core CMS, and so forth. If they're not part of that, they won't be used, because, you know, journalists already have a lot of tools to deal with, a lot of tasks to deal with, and they don't want to have yet another tool which don't give them immediate benefits. I mean, it might be good for the readers, it might be good for the overall product, but for the journalist, there needs to be an obvious time-saving opportunity, for example.
Do you what is your view on how appropriate say the article or the program, I guess, or podcast, how appropriate those units are for the audiences in the digital environment? I mean, is there a do we have a units problem in news? Are there perhaps opportunities to do things differently? I guess in this case, in the larger form of news experience.
I think it's an overall problem, at least for us, that we know we have so much material and we know so little about it. I think it was actually you who said it, David, that do we actually have it if we don't know what it is, So I think there is a great value to getting to know our stories better and our material better. And for sure, if you get all this noise with what you're actually looking for, it's not so good in the end.
And what about for storylines? Do you think the article is the right unit to build storylines from?
Yeah, we think it's the right unit to build storylines from just because it's our main, it's our main publication format. It's our atomic unit, and there's it won't change in the near future. That doesn't mean that it's the perfect format for the digital audience. If you think of storylines, for example, the shooting there in this movie set, we have a lot of redundancy in these articles because we always need to, there's always maybe in the first paragraph or in the second paragraph, there's a short wrap up of what has happened. And all of that is already boring to a reader who has already read about that. So maybe building storylines also will help us in finding the difference between articles, and then maybe removing that redundancy to a certain degree. For example, we're not going to tell you again what happened. If you want to know about this, read this and that story. So yeah.
Yeah, we also have a collaboration with the university here about multi-article summarization. And we also thought, okay, this might be a natural input for such a summarization approach, going the direction what Timo was just explaining. So again, it could be another building block in this kind of context.
And I think that podcasts, often I think you actually want to consume them as a whole. But we have this crossover, this sort of middle segment where there's sort of halfway radio shows and halfway podcasts, and sometimes it's this case with many different topics in one podcast. And in those cases, it's definitely good to divide them into segments, I would say.
Okay, let me ask one last question before we go to questions from the audience. So kind of stepping back to AI as a sort of a broad area, machine learning and the possibilities from it and so on. If AI were perfect, like if these things worked, to the best degree that you could expect them to work, and that might even be beyond the human capability and would be in many cases, what would you do with it? Like what applications would you build from that in news? If the quality of the AI was not a problem.
So right now,
this is a little speculative here.
Okay, can I start?
Go for it.
So yeah, well, I'm very my mind is very much set on this product right now. So that's the only context I can think within right now. But then I would absolutely make these timelines automatically. So someone is searching for some kind of keyword, for example, the Prime Minister assassination, for example, and you just get a timeline of all the events, all the stories, and you can just jump right into it and get a full explanation of the entire story from start to end, including what people knew at what times and when things started to become common knowledge and so forth.
Very good. I guess that would resonate with the TX team as well.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, so if I can speculate about, if we would be 100% sure what the output would be correct, we could think about completely changing the front page for news, evolve along stories. We have this sequence of articles popping up all the time and without any context. So maybe we could really change it in an automatic way. I don't know, Timo.
I've already told David I'm a big infrastructure fan. So what I would do is, we also have a vast archive of content that we published, and it doesn't matter whether it's text or video or audio or whatever, and we know so little about it. And I envision, the perfect metadata machine that would just, with very high accuracy, tag every person, every location, and a lot of other things like simple things like reading length and whatnot, but then also the type of articles, the quotes that are in the article, who says what, etc., etc., etc. And with all that metadata, we could just build a much better distribution machine, basically, and then resurface our articles and distribute them better and profit more on the long tail side of traffic.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to some questions from the audience now. We've got a question here from Frederick, and this is for the Swedish radio team. Did you experiment with automatically ensuring a cohesive storyline when combining the podcast snippets together? So this is, I guess, a combination of the two. So, for example, ways of ensuring that there was no extensive repetition and that there was a similarity of style and so on. Did you look at that at all?
Sorry, I have to actually read the question now.
Basically, did you look at applying storylines to the podcast snippets?
No, we didn't. So right now there is like the tool that we are working on right now, or that we've been working on, is intended for editors. So it will be a human in the loop, and I don't like on a practical level, I don't see that being completely automated or there being rules that make it cohesive, because that's just a monumental task. And I think it will just from a practical standpoint, I think the human will do that kind of work.
Okay, so another question from Dina, and it's about investing in more detailed metadata for published stories, so geography, themes, keyword tags, and so on. Would that help detect related stories regardless of the publishing date? In other words, would that help to perhaps assemble some of these structures in ways that were a little more specific rather than relying on just the kind of the time they were published, for example?
Yeah, maybe I pick this up. So we have geographic tags and thematic tags, but like after some experiments, we found out that just using like persons was like the most reliable for us when doing some testings. I don't know how to interpret this. Maybe it just tells us that stories in journalism, they always evolve along persons. So that's something that people can relate to. And we also came to the conclusion that we want to use the temporal information in some way, because most clustering methods on text, they don't have this kind of temporal dimension. So we used the simplest possible restriction that was just some kind of time boundary. But we are aware of the fact that that's a little bit too hard. So we need to kind of relax this a little bit. So yeah, this is why we use these two things, and only these two things, because like doing some qualitative checks on more options that gave us strange results, sometimes putting articles into storylines that didn't belong there. So that's really, at the moment, that's a relatively qualitative assessment by just looking at hundreds of storylines. Needs to be evaluated better, but yeah, that's just our take on that thing. But sure, there's a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah, and on a related note, Charlie has a question around ways of demonstrating the return on investment for these kind of tools. It's a very plausible hypothesis that these use cases are going to be valuable to audiences. But have you thought about ways of measuring these through analytics?
Yeah, we think we definitely would need to measure that. I mean, the baseline would be, for example, right now we have this related articles section below the article, and we know how many people click on that, what time they spent on these follow-up articles or related articles, and then we would have to compare that with articles suggested by our storyline engine. That's one thing, but the return on invest for the journalists themselves would maybe be, that they could resurface their older articles, which are still relevant and valid today, and then, get some additional page views, because that's actually something our journalists are keen on, and I totally understand that.
Might there be other? These are harder metrics to get at, but some ways of evaluating the depth of which the depth with which people can engage with either storylines or subject matter. Kajsa, you mentioned the racism example. And I know this is this is not something you're going to get to in analytics. But might there be value in kind of trying to measure the depth of understanding on subjects or storylines in addition to just the access to them?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we were to create a playlist on racism, just to stick to that example, and then I can say that each listener would be so much worth to us, because that's typically a group of people maybe that we are not serving too well today. So each and every one of them is worth a lot to us.
Any view from the TX team on evaluating understanding of storylines?
Well, I think we could measure the time our readers spent on a certain storyline because we would know which articles belong to that storyline. And then also compare that to articles not belonging to a storyline, and maybe, you know, the overall goal anyway would be to increase the engagement, to keep the reader longer on our platform. That's the overall goal, because then we assume the experience is better.
Okay, I think we lost the last sentence there, but I think we're at the end of our session. We're at the top of the hour, so so perhaps we should wrap it up there. So thank you to everybody, and thank you to the audience members who posted questions. It was a good session.
I can only add to that and confirm. Thank you so much. So thank you, Kajsa and Erik. Thank you, Tim and Timo. And David, thank you so much for bringing us all together in this session and for moderating the conversation. It's been great working with you, of course, over the past 6 months. So I'm really excited we got the opportunity to showcase your work. So thank you again for joining us today at the festival.
Thank you so much.
Good. So that brings us to the end of this session for the Journalism AI Festival. So I'll bring back my slides now just for the quick goodbye at the end of this session. We are going to take a break now. We're right at the midpoint of this festival session. So there is no session coming up at 2:30 p.m. GMT like yesterday, but we will be back later on at 4:15 p.m. London time, so GMT, with Cynthia, Jay, Pedro, and Amy in a session that we have co-designed with the Associated Press to discuss how to make the most of AI for your newsroom, especially if you are a local small news organization. That's the session coming up for today. It's going to be the last session of day 3 of this Journalism AI Festival. What's left for me is just to thank everybody for following us online. I encourage you to check out the project of the Swedish radio team. The link was shared on YouTube during the session. And thank you again for joining us today. Looking forward to see you later on back at the Journalism AI Festival.